Hello. Today we're continuing with the Q&A session that we've started and we've been doing slightly sporadically with a few interruptions over the last month or so. And this time we're looking at the broader question of essentially why did the Romans conquer or defeat the Macedonians, the Seleucids, the great powers of the Hellenistic world as quickly as they did compared to, say, the long slog against Carthage. So there are a whole number of questions related to this, so we'll just go through a few of them and start with this. Why were the Hellenistic empires so easily defeated by Rome? These were large, populous, and wealthy empires with extensive experience in warfare against both civilized states and barbarians, yet they were less able to oppose Rome than many Celtic and Iberian tribes. Comparison with Carthage is particularly striking. 3 brutal, decades-long wars with Rome, while the Diadochenes surrendered after losing their first or second battle. Then, was the Roman army truly better than the Hellenistic armies they faced? Rome wins the vast majority of the pitched battles. Is this fate, or is there really something superior about the Roman war machine? I've heard 1,000 answers to this question. I'm a military historian. Related to that, if you're still looking for questions, I would ask whether the Roman success was due to the tactical flexibility of the centuries, cohorts and legions, or something to do with the Romans themselves. Could they have been as successful if they'd used typical Greek formations and equipment? Don't necessarily mean the phalanx. What are your thoughts on why the Hellenistic kingdoms were so thoroughly trounced in every engagement and war against the Roman Republic, and not just on a tactical level? Or this one, you mentioned in your video about Rome versus Hellenistic kingdoms that Philip V hadn't fought many battles before espcially because pitched battles were rare for the Hellenistic world. Was it the same also for Antiochus III, the Battle of Magnesia? Do you also lack experience with major battles? And then you've got one reply there. Had experience of major battles dealing with the rebels in the upper satrapies and against the Ptolemies. So again, we'll come back to that because it's not that recent experience in some cases. And then finally, one that's, I think, related in the theme, if you were a Hellenistic monarch, what steps would you take to prepare your kingdom for a chance in the inevitable Roman confrontation? So we have a broad range of questions, and we won't be able to cover every aspect of this, but it seemed worth, given that so many people had raised various aspects of this seemed worth a video trying to cover a little bit, at least be an introduction. I suspect we will do more specific videos, perhaps one on each of the major battles. I think that might be quite interesting and part of a broader theme over the next year or so, that we'll look at specific battles, as we have done with Granicus so far. And we'll start to do that sort of thing and see what we can learn. The specifics are always fascinating, and you have to be very careful when you're generalizing to make sure that any of these broad sweeping claims you make do actually fit with what we understand about the individual battles, but also the individual battles need that broader context. So this will be something where we'll touch on this a little bit today, but I won't be able to go through all of the battle narratives in any real detail, because there simply isn't time. We'll also look at some other aspects, the cultural sides of things, but again, as is always the case when you start talking about these sorts of things, it raises lots of bigger questions. Even with my rambling, waffling and long-winded style, we don't want one video going on for hours and hours and hours that tries to cover everything, and even then there'll still be things where you could say, actually, there's another way of looking at it. So we'll try to answer some of those questions, but also think about how it all happened. And essentially the big question is this. We all know about Alexander the Great. We know of the incredible successes won by his father Philip, but particularly Alexander himself. Philip comes to dominate southern Greece, and also, though the Greek sources don't talk about this so much, dominates the Illyrians, the Thracians, the peoples on his border, in a way that no Macedonian king has done in the past. There is something new and very different about Philip's approach to this, which involves the creation of a military machine that really is unlike anything that's been seen anywhere, but particularly within the Greek world, even though it builds on ideas of warfare and that tradition. We tend to focus naturally on the battlefield aspects of this. So the combination of the pike phalanx. Philip doesn't have hoplites like the southern Greek states. He doesn't have the society to produce those sorts of volunteer soldiers who are still very, very effective. and you don't have the money for the equipment, the protective armor, this sort of thing. So the phalanx is based around a soldier who is the hetairoi of the king. They're companions of the king, just like the companion cavalry, but they are more simply equipped. They have basic armor, helmet, a smaller shield than a hoplite has, and they have a much longer spear, the sarissa, that is held in two hands rather than one. And it's all very much about formation. It's not fighting as an individual, it's fighting as a group. So you have that element to your army. You also have the spectacular, the heavy cavalry, particularly the companions that Alexander will become famous for leading in these great charges that punch through the enemy line. Philip's army is tactically successful because he combines those two elements plus others, the Thessalian cavalry, lots of different types of mercenaries, into this very well-balanced, rather supple team that can turn almost any situation to its advantage. Southern Greek armies, they've got good heavy infantry. The hoplite phalanx is a good solid thing, but they don't have a lot else that's terribly adaptable, flexible, and that the commanders are used to using. Philip develops this team. This army fights hard, but it marches hard as well. So there's a tactical element to it. It's very good fighting in pitched battles, but also a strategic element that it's very, very good marching fast, turning up when you're not expecting them, fighting through the winter, fighting through those periods when most armies would not, because Philip has organized a logistics system so you can supply and feed your soldiers and keep them going. And it gives a relentless quality to his war making that had simply not been there before. And then the third element is the technical element that is expressed most clearly in sieges. Philip pays for siege engineers and hires specialists. They're innovative, but they're professionals who work out how to do things. So in the past, it would take years, as it does in the Peloponnesian War, to blockade Plataea, a pretty small city really, into submission. Philip's men can attack and assault a city. They can also blockade it. So once you get surrounded by them, you can't feel you're safe behind your walls. You can't just wait for them to go away. They are coming for you, and you have to actively defend against them. And even then, you're not certain of anything. So you start to think, well, is it worth surrendering in the first place? And Philip is very good. There's the famous comment that Cicero quotes later that no fortress is safe if a mule with panniers of gold can get up there. Essentially, if you can bribe someone to let you in or bribe them to surrender. So he uses a combination of force, diplomacy, subtlety, manipulation, treachery even. The famous comment that Philip was supposed to be prouder of his diplomatic successes than his military ones, which is not the sort of thing you can imagine Alexander saying, though again, he uses essentially the same system and uses it with such success that he goes off, conquers the Persian Empire, and then keeps going and is quite successful in northern India as well. That has been a military revolution. Tactical level is what we focus on, but it's really the strategic level that makes this so effective. Both Philip and Alexander fight far more sieges than they ever do pitched battles. Think about it, Alexander basically fights 4 in his campaigns at Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, and then the Hydaspes. Philip 4 or 5 in his career. Lots of fighting, lots of skirmishes, some of it in the open, but also an awful lot of assault on walled cities and towns and villages. That's where so much of the fighting occurs. And that's also where both of them tend to get wounded more than they do in open battle. So the whole story of the Macedonian Revolution is one of an incredible political success, but also an incredible military success. And this spectacular empire that Alexander conquers so very, very fast is conquered by the spear, as they would put it in the ancient world, by the strength of his right arm. And it's done in this very traditional way. And it's done because this army proves itself superior to everybody else it encounters. Even if not in every aspect, it can always find a way to beat them. And the number of different elements that come into play, this mixed force that Philip has created and Alexander has honed to perfection, is superior to anything out there. By the way, you might hear some church bells in the background there. There's a service in the church across the road, and you might also hear Gussie complaining because he's just come in from the garden, and yeah, you want to go through the door, don't you? I thought you would. Anticipated that, but you've done it silently. I've also got rather a croaky voice. I'm getting over a nasty bug where I lost my voice for a day or two, so there'll be lots of pauses to take a sip of something cool. I think it's Coke Zero or something like that. I think I've got this morning. It would be water, but if I leave a glass of water down beside my chair, Gussie will start drinking from it, and There are some things that you don't mind sharing, but water with a cat is not a good one. So the story of Alexander is one of great military success. And after that, that system of warfare shows itself to be superior to virtually everything else out there for a very long time. Alexander's empire fragments, but the bulk of the conquests remain under control of his successors. And eventually you have the three big kingdoms that emerge: Ptolemies, based around Egypt, the Antigonids in Macedonia itself, and then the Seleucids in the eastern part of the empire. There's always a tendency when you look at the map to think of the Seleucids as focusing very much, that this is an empire that at times reaches to northern India, and Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great, one of the men who will fight against the Romans, does campaign there. But if you think about it, Seleucia on the Tigris is quite far to the west. Antioch, the other big city, is right there near the Mediterranean. So there is always an element, these are looking back towards the center of the Greek world. They're looking back towards the Macedonian homeland. All of these dynasties consider themselves the rightful successors and heirs to Alexander. And they are trying to win at that level, which is hence the fact you get the funeral games that are intensive for a decade or two and then sporadic afterwards, where you are fighting and you're always trying to dominate all of it. There is this dream, reuniting Alexander's empire, becoming king of Macedonia and most of the world as well. That's your ambition, even if most of you realize, okay, well, I'm not going to get there in my lifetime, but I can move by stages to that point. At least, again, after the initial stages of the funeral games, when everybody thinks it's all up for grabs. So they fight each other, and they fight against other groups as well. Again, if you're king of Macedonia, you're going to find yourself ranged up against Illyrians and Macedonians to the north. You're going to have trouble with the southern Greeks as well, periodically. So there is warfare there. If you are in Egypt, you occasionally have threats from the south, but more often you occasionally have internal rebellion as well. More likely you're facing off against one of the other successors. You're right there on the Mediterranean. Alexandria is founded as the new Athens. You are thinking very much, and it's much easier for you to send competitors to the Olympic Games, get involved in Greek politics, almost as easy it is for the king in Macedon himself. The Seleucids are a little bit further removed. They have to fight more often against people in Bactria, Sogdiana, northern India. They have internal rebellions. They have the eventual development by the later 3rd century BC of kingdoms like Pergamon and Asia Minor that have managed to break away. And they are not in the top league. They are down a level from the big three, but nevertheless, these are formidable kingdoms that are Hellenistic and are able to maintain their independence. So let's think about the story of their contact with Rome. Now I've got a chronology here. So let's do the story first, and we won't talk too much about Pyrrhus today. Pyrrhus is the first Hellenistic leader to fight the Romans, the first person who brings an army of packed phalanxes, heavy cavalry, and in his case war elephants as well, and confronts the Roman legions and inflicts several defeats on them. Now the war with Pyrrhus, 280 to 275 BC, it is a bit different. It is something we will come back to because there were a few questions about Pyrrhus as well. So sometime we will look in more detail at Pyrrhus. For today, it's really just to say there's a slightly different pattern to this war. In the first place, this is the only war we will discuss that occurs in Italy itself. Pyrrhus comes as ally to the city of Tarentum. He is one of the ablest of the commanders produced of that sort of first generation after Alexander. The people who've grown up with that sense of having to live up to this spectacular style of leadership and military success. And they're combining, Plutarch emphasizes that Pyrrhus fights sword and spear in hand at the head of his men, but also is controlled, cool, the battlefield manager, all this sort of thing. There's one story he tells where he can see an Italian horseman stalking him, and he changes his uniform basically with one of his staff, and this poor bloke gets jumped on by the Romans, and then Pyrrhus goes, you can't imagine Alexander doing that. So there are differences. This isn't quite Alexander's world, but there is also a sense of trying to live up to that spectacular and conspicuous bravery of someone like Alexander and to a great extent Philip II. So during this war, there are really three major battles. 280, the Romans get beaten at Heraclea. 279, at Asculum. 275, they are able to defeat Pyrrhus at Malventum, though they don't destroy his army in the same way that they will tend to do in the other battles. So a couple of big differences to what will come later. This war is fought in Italy. This war is prolonged. It involves three major battles as well as other fighting, and only then is it decided. Both of those features will not be followed when we come through. However, one feature in common, apart from the whole tactical elements of the clash between the legion and the phalanx, though a legion that perhaps has not quite developed as much as the ones that will feature in the 2nd century BC, is that you have allies involved on the Roman side, but also on the Macedonian side. Sorry, Macedonian, Epirus. Pyrrhus is king of Epirus, but Tarentum, obviously a major ally, but then there are Oscans and others. And as we'll see, Polybius notes that these people, many of them, fight in their traditional way. So this isn't just a simple, right, I've taken you over, now I'm going to train you to fight my way. Bear in mind as well, go back to the start, Philip and Alexander were really good at bolting on all sorts of ethnic contingents, other types of troops into their own army without changing the equipment, even the basic tactics. They made them part of this team. And Philip's doing that from the start. Alexander continues, so he can add on horse archers that will play quite a prominent role at Hydaspes, for instance, people he's acquired and recruited in Central Asia. The Romans win the war against Pyrrhus through stubbornness, refusal to negotiate. You know, Appius Claudius Caecus the Blind is famed for having persuaded the Senate not to negotiate with Pyrrhus when they were considering it, but to keep on fighting, and eventually they win. As I say, a lot's different, and it's something we'll come to on its own another time. Not too long after that, a decade or so later, you have the beginning of the First Punic War, a dispute over basically Roman intervention in Sicily that the Carthaginians considered to be their sphere of influence. Lasts for the best part of 20 years. Only about 4 big land battles, but very large battles at sea as the Romans turn themselves into a naval power and show the same stubbornness they've shown against Pyrrhus, in that when they lose fleets, they build another one and they keep on going and they outlast the Carthaginians. But also this adaptability, this ability to learn. They weren't a naval power before, they need to be to face the Carthaginians, so they work out how to do it. And there's some mistakes and some hitches along the way, and a lot of ships lost in storms by Roman admirals who underestimate the power of the sea to their great loss. But essentially, it's a naval war. So it's a war decided at sea. That's the big thing. And that will, of course, lead generation later to the Second Punic War beginning in 218 BC, the great epic when Hannibal invades Italy from his base in Spain. A war that spreads, a war that again lasts not quite 20 years, but close to it, and involves lots more battles on land. There aren't really big sea battles in the Second Punic War. There are lots of battles on land, and early on in particular, at the hands of Hannibal, the Romans do very, very badly. A third of the Senate is dead within the first 3 campaigns. Best part of 100,000 citizen and allied soldiers are dead at that time. Now, Rome has huge resources of manpower, but even so, this is a terrific cost. And yet they keep going, they don't negotiate, and eventually they win. Now, as part of that, because this is a war that will be fought in other theatres as well, we have the First Macedonian War. In the aftermath of Cannae, as large parts of southern Italy defect to Hannibal, Philip V, the king of Macedon, who's got a bit worried because the Romans have been intervening along the Illyrian coast in the years just before the war, feels this is treading on his territory really, and now sees the Romans with a sword to their neck. Hannibal looks as if he's going to win. Isn't this a marvellous time to make friends with Hannibal and do your best to re-establish your dominance in the wider sphere of influence around Macedonia and push out those Romans? So from 214 to 205, you get the First Macedonian War, because obviously the Romans aren't too pleased with this. And in spite of the crisis at home, they send an army with naval assets to Greece. But it's fairly limited. This is never more than what the Romans would term a Praetorian army. That's 1 legion and a similar sized ala of allies. and ships as well. So there is naval fighting. And they rely very much on local allies, in particular the Aetolian League, who are rivals of Philip, and asserting their own control of central western Greece, really, that sort of area. The Romans fight with them. They're more of a supporting. It's in many respects, the Romans are almost the subordinate ally in this struggle. It's a war not of big battles. It's a war of raids, blockades, sieges, but the Romans don't possess the ruthless and sophisticated siege techniques of Philip or Alexander or that era. The Macedonians still do to an extent, but they don't have the army that's willing to risk the casualties in direct assault quite so often. Philip V does pretty well in this. He comes across, he gets quite a good write-up from Polybius, for instance, as a sort of dramatic, dashing leader of fairly small forces, mostly of cavalry and lighter troops, peltasts, skirmishers, that sort of thing. Actually, the sort of stuff that Philip II did, quite a lot of his campaigns. But these are not really big phalanx battles. He holds his own. There are some gains for the Romans and their allies, but eventually the Aetolian League decides to make peace with Philip separately, and the Romans continue for a little while afterwards, but basically realize they can't fight this war, and the big priority is still defeating Carthage, so the Romans make peace as well. But it's deeply unsatisfying by Roman standards, but it has not been a major Roman commitment to the whole conflict. So then, barely a year after the completion of the truce treaty bringing the Second Punic War to its end, they've finally beaten Hannibal, they finally prevailed there. The leaders of the Senate decide that, well, Philip stabbed us in the back, he kicked us when we were down, joined Hannibal, there wasn't really any good reason for this, he just was an opportunist, we've got to punish him. It's one of those interesting cases, and again, I've talked about this a bit in the Conquered and the Proud lecture series, where maybe we'll do some more about it some other day. But for once, the Roman people won't vote for war. They refuse the first vote to declare war on Philip. There's then a meeting, a big speech, recorded in Livy, where the consul puts the case of saying, well, look how much trouble we had with Hannibal. It took all those years, all that appalling loss in life, in devastation of our farmland, to defeat him. Philip V is only a few days away across the Adriatic. He's within reach of Italy. He could land an army in Italy. He could do what Hannibal's just done, and we need to stop him before he gets to that point. We can't let him think we're weak. We can't let him think that he's got a chance. He's our enemy. He made that clear by declaring war without provocation as far as we saw it. Therefore, we've got to deal with him, and the people do vote for war, and it goes ahead. This war then lasts from 200 to 196. The Romans will send a consular army of 2 legions and 2 allies. We will look at the specific battles in a minute. Actually, should we do that now? Let's see. Yeah, let's come through. So it's a fairly lackluster thing. That the pattern is much the same. The Romans ally with Greek allies again. That will be a theme all the way through, and that's the aspect in common with Pyrrhus, is that these are never wars of just the Romans against either the Macedonians or the Seleucids. They are always wars where the Romans have quite a few allies. There are allies on the other side as well, but particularly for the Romans, these are not wars fought solely by Roman armies, and even though the Romans are in control and the Romans provide the commander-in-chief. Now, obviously, the Romans make a lot of use of non-Roman soldiers throughout Rome's history. Apart from the fact that half your army is usually Latin or other allies that you send out, you get troops from the Iberian Peninsula, or wherever you might be. Obviously, Zama, the big victory over Hannibal at the end of the Second Punic War, is won to a great extent by through the use of the Numidian allies under Massinissa that the Romans for Scipio has acquired just before. So I think the big difference here is that the allies tend to be much more active players in what's going on. In the First Macedonian War, really, they are dominant. After that, that's not the case, but they are a significant factor within this for both sides. We'll come back to that later, but just wanted to highlight it now. Not too much happens in the first couple of years of the war, and eventually a consul who makes the gains election at the age of 30, Flamininus. Now again, that's a sort of holdover from the Second Punic War, when you've had Scipio Africanus as a young man being given proconsular imperium in Spain, and then later on being elected consul when he's too young, being given the African command. It's this continuation of, well, we've lost a lot of talented and experienced men early on that haven't been replaced yet by people of suitable age, but also let's go for somebody who's really good. Flamininus is one of those men who's made a name for himself during the Second Punic War. Again, we'll come back to this context later on. In 198, he wins a fairly minor victory, forcing Philip out of a position along a river. He then negotiates with Philip until Flamininus discovers that he's not going to be replaced by one of the last year's consuls or the new year's consuls. Instead, they're going to northern Italy to deal with problems there. Therefore, his command is going to be extended. Breaks off negotiations, continues the war, and you have the Battle of Espcially. Again, yeah, let's talk a little bit about that now. How are we going to do it? Well, yeah, let's see. Philip V has an army that seems to consist of about 16,000 pikemen, about 5,500 to 7,500 other infantry, peltas, mercenaries, skirmishers, that sort of thing, allies of various sorts, about 2,000 cavalry. Not a huge army, and not as big, say, as the one that Alexander starts off his eastern campaigns with, let alone as it grows and gets bigger and bigger as you start to acquire more and more allies that goes on. So it's the Macedonian core of it is actually fairly similar in numbers to Alexander's force, but you haven't got all the extra allies that Alexander takes from southern Greece, from Thessaly, from Thracians, Illyrians. Not in the numbers, not in the quantities that they had. The second thing is it's a much less experienced army. We'll come back to that later. Flamininus has standard consular Roman army of 2 legions plus 2 allies, plus local Greek allies, Aetolians and others. Estimated between 20 to 30,000 infantry and about 2,000 cavalry. So perhaps an advantage in infantry, perhaps not a vast one. Probably something like parity in cavalry. He's also got a small number of war elephants supplied by Numidia. So, Massinissa, not there in person, but has sent a contingent of troops and these elephants to support the Roman army. The Romans win. We'll look at how they do it a little bit later, but it's worth just at the moment giving a sense of scale of all of this. And from then on, this is the battle that decides the war. So there's really only one major pitched battle in this conflict, even though it lasts for 4 years. The Romans win it. Philip V very soon afterwards decides that, well, the game's up. I can't replace the losses I've suffered. Casualties are disproportionately heavy for the losing side, as they often are in ancient battles. And there's a story at Espcially as well of Macedonian pikemen raising their pikes to signify that they're surrendering, the Romans not understanding it, so it takes a while before somebody tells them what's going on and they stop killing these men who are... So Philip can't replace the losses that he's suffered and concedes defeat to the Romans. The Romans don't ask for a lot at this stage. I mean, Flamininus will go and declare the freedom of the Greeks at the Olympic Games. This is very much, it's the sort of thing that Hellenistic kings have been doing for generations. Everybody says that they're fighting on behalf of the liberty of all the sort of the nice Greeks, the ones who are decent and who are being oppressed by somebody like the Aetolian League or whichever power happens to be dominant. Leagues are a big feature of this period. You had the bigger cities like Athens, let alone Sparta, even Corinth, don't matter quite so much on their own. You have to combine together to make that much of an impact, really, at a military and political level. But it's also that this degree of unification almost is very limited. This still remains Greece, where everybody really wants to do their own thing and each community is proud of its own identity. So you have these leagues formed, but you also have, it's never taking over all of southern Greece. And southern Greece is never united, which is one of the elements that's always there and is reflected in the way the campaigns develop, particularly in and around Greece itself. Slightly less so for the Seleucids, but even there, it's an element where you have lots of different people, all with their own agendas, all looking at, well, who is big and strong? Who can I get on my side to deal with my local rivals? The Romans are being receiving embassies all the time, appealing for aid, for influence. This is what Greek cities have done in this world when these big powers emerge. And it goes back to earlier on when you would go to a big city and ask them for help. Think of Plataea, mentioned earlier. They become allies of the Athenians because they go to Sparta asking for protection against Thebes. The Spartans can't be bothered, but they want to mess about the Thebans, so they say, well, go and have friends with Athens, be friends with Athens, they're close to you. It's this pattern, and you get some long-term alliances like Plataea and Athens, but you get lots of others where people change almost with the wind, depending on what's perceived to be their advantage, their perception of their own status, their own honour. So that the Romans are coming into an existing political, diplomatic setup and power balance that is always changing. Everybody's reassessing all the time, so it's part of that. So Philip loses some money, loses prestige, his army is battered for the foreseeable future, but he's still king of Macedonia. He is still able to pass the throne on to his son. Macedonia is not destroyed. It's a fairly limited victory. The Romans accept the Macedonians as subordinate allies, just as they've done elsewhere. Again, this is something we talk about in more detail in the Conquered and the Proud when we're looking at imperialism in the Hellenistic world and the wars there. So you then have in 192 to 189 the Syrian war against the Seleucids, led by Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great, which, while we'll focus on the Battle of Magnesia that decides it, begins when Antiochus receives appeals for help from communities within Greece and decides to come in to protect the liberty, the freedom of the Greeks, in this case against Rome and anybody else, and sends an expeditionary force to Greece. It's fairly small. It's 10 to 15,000 men, not more than that, and with the assumption that allies will come locally, and perhaps that he's perfectly entitled to do this. He doesn't really think that the Romans are going to intervene. He's not had hostile relations with the Romans before this to any extent. And he is a powerful, strong king, head of a big empire. He has done a lot to restore control in the east and in the north. He's fought against the Ptolemies. You've had the big battle at Rhaphia in 217 at the early days of the Second Punic War. One of the largest battles of this era, where 60, 70,000 plus men fight on either side, plus large numbers of elephants. And both armies are of the Hellenistic pattern, fight in basically the same way, so numbers start to count with this sort of thing. You need more than the enemy. But the expedition to Greece is fairly small. The main encounter occurs in the pass of Thermopylae, famous from 480 BC, and rather the same thing happens. Antiochus and his men adopt a very strong defensive position blocking the pass. The Romans beat their head against it, can't break through. However, a flanking force discovers a route around. Cato the Elder threatens some poor local peasant and gets him to lead them path around, and just as the Persians have done, they outflank the position, come around behind them, and the defense collapses. So there's an element where history is repeating itself, but then that's the nature of these things. A pass can be a good place to defend for a while, but if it's like Thermopylae, you have to be willing to move. You have to be ready and think, well, there is going to come a point when they're bound to work out there's a way around this. That, however, leaves the Romans pretty miffed with Antiochus, so they will, a little bit later, give the war against Antiochus as a province one of the consuls, in this case Lucius Scipio, the younger brother of Scipio Africanus. Africanus goes with him as advisor on his staff, and that's part of the reason he gets the job, but he doesn't in fact fight at the main battle of Magnesia. Magnesia is fought in 190. It's the biggest of all the battles we'll look at in this, and it's a little bit hard to get precise numbers, as with all of these. We've got an element of guesswork, but let's look at what we're sort of thinking roughly for the Seleucids, and you can see it's substantially larger than Philip V's force. So Antiochus is credited with 60,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry by Livy, or about 70,000 in total by Appian, so pretty much the same. There's some breakdown, but it doesn't include all the contingents. So he's supposed to have 16,000 or more men in the phalanx, but you also have the Argiraspides, the Silver Shields, the sort of elite unit, descendants of the elite unit back from Alexander's day. Might be up to 10,000 of those. Who knows? It's quite a lot. So it's a very large phalanx, bigger than Philip V's. You've also got Galatians, you've got Cappadocians, you've got lots of skirmishers, and a lot of cavalry. About half of those, 6,000 or so, are described as cataphracts, some of whom are horse and rider fully armed, you know, the man with the helmet with the face mask. Whether all the formation is like that or the rear ranks are less well protected because they don't need to be quite so heavily armed, we don't quite know. You've got horse archers, Dahai, you've got Agama, the guard cavalry, you've got other groups, you've got 54 elephants, and these are Indian elephants. So the Romans don't have much this time, but this is a substantial force of war elephants, of the biggest and meanest around in this era. Remember, Indian elephants are bigger than the types found in Africa that are used for war in this period. He's got scythe chariots, there's even a few camels and bits and bobs like that. So it's a very large force, and it shows the diversity of the Seleucids' great empire, in that you have horse archers from Central Asia, you have Indian elephants, and you've got cataphracts. Again, this idea that probably you've picked up from, well, groups that the Greeks just tended to call Scythians and vague terms like that, but peoples to the north. You know, you've already got that contact with the groups that are going to become the Parthians and that sort of thing. And the Seleucid Empire is big, and just as the Achaemenid Persians have had trouble holding it together, as Alexander, in the brief time he has it, has had trouble holding it together, you get outbreaks of rebellion in various places, particularly on the fringes. Areas open to the steppe are especially vulnerable to warlords coming in and saying, I will help you rebel, or just coming in to take it over. But other groups do. So it's a reflection of the strength and size of the empire, the variety of different fighting styles you've encountered, and that, like Alexander, you are trying to incorporate into one fighting force. However, unlike Alexander, this is not an army that in this form has been campaigning regularly. So while, as one of the commentators mentioned, Antiochus has fought big battles before, not for a long time. And not with this army, though some of the troops and many of the officers might well have taken part in them. This is not the same very well practiced team that Alexander will lead into Asia and all the way through, or even that of the early successors. This is something where, yes, you do know about big battles, they do happen occasionally, but on the whole, a lot of the fighting elsewhere probably doesn't involve major pitched battles. When you're fighting against the Ptolemies, as at Raphia, which is a slogging match, lacking in great subtlety, you're fighting against people who, pretty much like you, have the same tactical and advantages, the same sort of equipment as you in the main. When you're fighting further east, you are generally not fighting against armies with good heavy infantry. The culture is different. You tend to be fighting more against lighter troops, and particularly cavalry, which present very different problems. So one thing I would say as qualification is that, yes, he's fought battles before, yes, he is a successful commander, but he hasn't fought this sort of enemy before, only in the Thermopylae campaign. And he doesn't have an army that's a permanent thing that he can basically move along and assume everybody knows what they're doing. This is an army you've called together for the campaign, and it's learning as it goes along. Now, that's also true of the Romans, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. Now, the Roman army they're facing consists, again, the standard consular army, what you normally give to a consul, 2 legions and 2 alii. So same sort of army, same basis to the army as the one that Flamininus has had at Cynocephalae. The impression is from Livy, these legions, and presumably the allied units as well, were a little bit stronger from the start. So we talk about a legion, but the Senate decided each year how big that would be, and that could vary by a couple of thousand men. So it could be right about the 4,000 mark, or it could be the 6,000 mark. These are somewhere over 5,000 when first formed. You've also got allies from Macedonia, so the people you've not long fought against, because again, you know, Philip V isn't too keen on Antiochus doing well, let alone Antiochus coming to Greece, treading on his territory and becoming a significant diplomatic and political force there again. Don't like that, thank you very much. But also, he's behaving as a subordinate ally of the Romans ought to behave. We've beaten you, but now we'll accept you, but you know, when we ask for things, you need to give them to us. So he gives supplies, he also gives some troops. You've also got troops from Greece, you've got troops from Asia Minor, in particular the Kingdom of Pergamum, which send a very large contingent under Eumenes, who plays a distinguished role in the battle. It's perhaps a reflection of the sources in that, as a Greek king, he was better able to get people to write about how wonderful he was, but also does seem to reflect reality as well. The reason Pergamum's surviving is that they had able leaders like this. There are also 16 elephants, so there are some Numidian contingents and people from there as well, including these, but they're the African elephants that are smaller, and obviously they don't have anywhere near as many of them as Antiochus. So Appian suggests a total of about 30,000 for this army, perhaps 6,000 plus or so were cavalry. Pergamum has sent a very strong and effective cavalry contingent. But it's hard to be sure. Some people would say, oh no, the Romans are exaggerating and, Antiochus's army wasn't as big. Well, this is on the, very much on the same scale as the one he'd taken to Rafai. So it's certainly not beyond the resources of his empire by any stretch of the imagination. Others have tried to claim the Roman army was bigger, but there's no real evidence for that. So it might be worth emphasizing that a lot of Antiochus's troops are probably quite lightly armed and more skirmishers, so aren't really going to be able to contribute too much to the main fighting. More significantly, as we'll come on to later, then a lot of them are not very experienced. But the result is another Roman victory. Although Antiochus does manage to break through one section of the Roman line, he isn't able to exploit that, and the Romans, led in part by Eumenes, have done well on the other flank, and his army collapses. Again, we'll look at the tactical detail a little bit more when we come on later on. And that decides the war. One big battle, one big defeat, and Antiochus III says, right, Gov, it's a fair cop, I'll be your ally. And the Romans demand money from him, they put restrictions on him, he's not to have war elephants, he's not to interfere in Greece and elsewhere, he's to recognise Pergamum, all these sorts of things. A very satisfactory thing, but like in Macedonia, it does not lead to a permanent Roman military presence there. Again, that's more into the sort of wider strategic thing, but nevertheless worth emphasising. And then finally we have the Third Macedonian War, 172 to 167, when Perseus, the son of Philip V, has been building up Macedonian power and Macedonian prestige for some time. And this is, the Romans see this as aimed against them. They see this as a threat, and they rather provoke this war by making very unreasonable demands on Perseus, the king. Again, several years like the Second Macedonian War, where not a lot happens, where there's manoeuvring and skirmishes, blockades of cities, some assaults, but nobody really gains a clear advantage. Then the Romans choose Aemilius Paulus, son of the consul killed at Cannae, quite an old man by this time, already had one consulship, so, and he goes off, pulls things together. Obviously, it helps that he's with the family that's connected with Polybius, and is the father of Scipio Aemilianus, who as a youngster takes part in this. And this time the Macedonian army is bigger. It's probably getting close to 40,000, something like that, maybe 21,000 of the phalanx, and then about 4,000 cavalry. The Romans once again have the standard consular army, 2 legions and 2 alai, but those legions and the ally were made exceptionally large at the start. So, they're at the top end, 6,000 plus as their AUBAT, really, their authorized strength. Again, how close reality matched that is hard to say. So perhaps the Roman part, 24 or even 26,000 foot if the ally was slightly bigger than the legions, which is sometimes the case. 1,200 horse, plus lots of allies, men from Pergamum, men from Numidia, men from Liguria, men from Greece. So 37 to 40,000 infantry, 40,000 cavalry, 22 elephants. So if anything, the numbers slightly favour the Romans, but not by a huge, huge degree. And they have parity in cavalry. They have the elephants that don't play that important a role, but nevertheless are an extra edge the Romans get. Battle begins almost accidentally with fighting of the outposts that people send in supports. Then Perseus decided, right, I'm going to lead the army out and deploy for battle. The Romans eventually realize, form up, and it's the story of Aemilius Paulus sacrificing and not getting the right result. Having to keep on doing it before the battle. Fortunately, the omens turn more favorable before he has to commit to battle. There's also the story Plutarch tells that he was supposed to have said afterwards that seeing the Macedonian phalanx coming at him was the most terrifying thing he'd ever seen in his life, which is interesting. But within an hour, this is seen as a very short battle by ancient standards. The Romans win, and Perseus' men suffer huge casualties, and the war is over. And at this point, the Romans get nasty. The Macedonian kingdom is abolished. It's broken up into districts. But again, the Romans do not yet annex it as a province, and that's it. That's the end of things. The Seleucids will come up, and they'll be abolished basically by Pompey in the 60s BC. But they're not a significant force by then because their empire has fallen apart, which is another. It's a very interesting story, but it's another story. We can't go into that today. The big group missing from all of this are, of course, the Ptolemies, who never fight the Romans until the very late days, and even then you can argue that the Romans are just interfering in Ptolemaic civil wars and power struggles. And poor old Cleopatra just keeps backing the wrong side in Roman civil wars. The Ptolemies have allied with Rome in the 3rd century BC and remain staunch in that, partly because it's a protection. Having the Romans as friends is a protection against the others. So when they are invaded, you have the famous Roman ultimatum and the drawing with a stick around the Seleucid king saying, pull out before, decide whether you're going to have peace or war with us before you step out of the ring, that sort of thing, and he backs down. This is in the aftermath of Pydna. So that's it. There is a 4th Macedonian war, but this is a slightly different thing. There's a chap called Andriscus who claims to be an illegitimate son of Perseus, claims to be heir to the throne, and with an essentially Thracian army invades the independent regions of Macedonia. They can't cope with him. The Romans send an army. It gets beaten. It's the first big defeat they suffer, and it's not really at the hands of a Macedonian army. And then after that, the Romans send more troops, and finally Macedonia becomes a province. So that's the pattern of it all. That's the story. And it is a striking thing that each of these conflicts is decided by one big battle. And each time the Romans win and the other side gives in. And in most cases, until Perseus, where they're a lot nastier with him, the Romans are happy to accept Philip V and Antiochus as subordinate allies. And they are allowed to go on ruling together. The Romans aren't that interested in taking over this area. So let's think about resources and context of it all. Resources are something you can't measure too precisely, but you can gain a strong impression. So if we look at the Hellenistic kingdoms, there is something of a problem. After Alexander, they are a rather stretched thing. Alexander has taken off soldiers and settled them down in colonies in his new empire. Some of them Macedonians, some of them Greeks. It depletes the Macedonian population. You have the mutinies, the discontent in Alexander's army. We'd like to go home. And remember that early on, he sends people on leave the first year to go back home, to tell people how great things are, but also so they could go and see their families and ideally father children to produce the next generation of Macedonians. You do have to wonder if in the longer term there was quite a bad effect on the population of Macedonia from Alexander's campaign, because you just took too many people away and they did not come back, and it was difficult for the population to recover. On the other hand, you could say that numbers-wise, they still seem to be producing enough, same sort of broadly similar numbers of men who could fight in the phalanx as you'd had in Philip's and Alexander's day. They're never able to produce such formidable cavalry in the quantities that Philip and Alexander possessed. So again, something that may have happened is your horse stocks may have suffered badly because you produced too many too quickly and then sent them off to war, and you didn't keep the stud farms stocked well enough. There's no direct evidence for that. That's merely a conjecture. But not even Perseus, who forms a very big army, not quite double, but certainly more than 50% bigger than the one his father had at Cynocephalae, and in that campaign, you're stretching your resources to get to that level. You simply don't have, because again, you just have Macedonia. And often you can't control Epirus, you're not dominating Thessaly, your influence in Thrace, in Illyria, places like that, and then Scythia beyond, varies. You can take some allies and troops from there, some mercenaries from there, but you don't have the control that Philip II had created for Philip V. And Philip V, he's fought a lot of campaigns, but he has, these, as I say, have been small scale to gain control, to gain dominance, to try and play the Greek states off against each other and become the biggest power in that area. But you get periodic interference from the Seleucids, from the Ptolemies, and then from the Romans, which is what causes you to declare war on the Romans when you think Hannibal's going to win. And you can get some of the goodies. It's a bit like Mussolini wanting to invade France late in 1940, in the 1940 campaign. And let's get involved, and then let's send squadrons to participate in the Battle of Britain, when it doesn't really matter by this time, and they're not really prepared for it, equipped for it. So Macedonia has limited resources. The Seleucids have far more. Just look at the size of Antiochus's army at Magnesia. However, under Philip II and Alexander, the phalanx had been recruited from people who were not, as we would understand it, professional soldiers, but they were, in a sense, sort of semi-full-time conscripts. He'd set them up, moving the population around, creating these settlements where basically the phalanxes were regionally based, and you had these towns where you would go and you would fight alongside neighbours and this sort of thing. It's a development of the hoplite ideal, but it was rather different because it was organised by royal authority and by central authority to a much greater extent than anything elsewhere. You had much more training because you were almost constantly on campaign. You might get to go home for the winter, some of it anyway, some of the time, but particularly once you go off to Asia with Alexander, that becomes less and less possible. So you are campaigning for years on end. So under Philip and then under Alexander, these people become as experienced as any professional soldiers at any time. They are extremely tough characters. They're used to long marches, hard living and fighting. And they also have, on top of that, the confidence of victory. But that is only the product of the near constant large-scale warfare that Philip II wages, and then Alexander continues. So you can create that system, but you can't maintain it all the time unless you've got that successful war-making going on regularly. Virtually every summer you're fighting someone, beating them, coming home with the loot and the glory. Philip V's phalanx and Perseus's phalanx consists mainly of men who are obliged to serve you, but who aren't that experienced, because most of the campaigns that you've fought before don't require large contingents of the phalanx. Part of it. Again, your cavalry and your lighter troops get more direct experience of campaigning and some experience of victory as well. But on the whole, your army is inexperienced. Again, we'll come back to that. The same is true of the Seleucids. You can form this really big army for Magnesia, just as you could for Raphia, but you can't keep that permanently in the field. It goes back to the idea, these cities you've created around the place where you have settlements originally of veterans who are obliged to serve, their sons to serve. It's the same idea as Philip II had used, creating these centres, which would be the basis for your regional regiments, effectively. But it's in a different context. It's all bigger because they're also very much garrison towns to control the subject population that you've conquered. So there's a different situation. So the numbers are there, and you have fought some wars, but you rarely fight a war on this scale. So these people are not a well-practiced team, as I said before. They're not people who've served together for a long period of time, got used to fighting together, trusting each other, knowing who's in charge and winning. A striking feature of Alexander's command style in particular is that he is able to go off charging on Bucephalus at the head of the royal Ilay of companions, steaming into the enemy and hacking around him, because he can trust subordinate commanders at all levels in other sectors of the battlefield to do the right thing, because they are an extraordinarily experienced team. They fought under Philip, they fought under Alexander. You know, a lot of these are really old hands, and they do the right thing. If there is a problem, they solve it at that level. The later Hellenistic kings don't have that team when they get to this level of fighting, because it is so much rarer. Again, yes, Antiochus has fought some battles before, but not often. It's not like Alexander, it's not like Philip II, where it's near constant, where you are real veterans. So you have a lot of manpower, you have a lot of money, but there are elements of your state you can't trust to fight for you, or who won't be too motivated if you do. I mean, the Ptolemies had a similar dilemma when do you recruit Egyptians or not, which they eventually do, but it does lead through the treatment of these soldiers to a major rebellion. And there's the thought that if you treat people as a subject population, well, what's in it for them to fight for you? So this deep connection, deep-seated ideal in the ancient world that if you fight conspicuously in war, you should be rewarded with greater political status, with greater legal status. You should be more important in the community the rest of the time. That's always the case, unless you have pure mercenaries, and then you've got to make sure you keep paying them all the time, and to keep them reliable, then you start using any of your subjects and you've got to give them something in return if you want them to fight well, because otherwise, why should they bother? So potentially, the Seleucid Empire has huge resources, and he is able to field cavalry in numbers that are far greater than anything the Macedonians can do. But there are limits to it, and once you suffer bad casualties and the prestige or the loss of prestige from the defeat at Magnesia, you think, right, okay, I can't deal with that. Partly because, remember, from Antiochus's perspective, he has this problem with the Romans in the west, but he would also have problems right out in the east, at the far stretch of his empire. He can't afford to spend too much time in one place. And there is a pattern, as you often get, that when the main focus of the government, of the state, of the king is on one region, then people elsewhere start thinking, well, this is a good opportunity for rebellion, or they feel neglected. So Antiochus can't afford to spend years and years fighting a big war against the Romans. Probably his mistake was to intervene in Greece in the first place, because otherwise there's no particular reason why the Romans would have looked in his direction. They were happy, they've dominated Macedonia, but they didn't want to go any further. So there's an element of misjudgment, but it's the optimism typical of a man who has fought with great success so far, and who sees the Romans as barbarians from the distant west, and Macedonia, well, if they could beat the Macedonians, yeah, well, who can't do that, this sort of thing. I can sort this out. But also that diplomatic instability you have, political instability, because you've got all these different Greek states who, when they feel they're not doing so well out of the current regime, look for somebody big and tough from outside and ask them for help. And there are always existing relationships, particularly with the Hellenistic powers. So Antiochus is an obvious one. And there's an element, if he refuses this, does that diminish his prestige as well? So it's a very difficult thing. There's a lot more context to this than we can deal with. Now, if we look at the Romans, in contrast, manpower is something they have in spades. So you have the famous passage of Polybius from before the Second Punic War, where he estimates that the Roman and Allied manpower of military age is, totals over 700,000. So vastly more than the sort of numbers we've been talking about for the armies in the field. And the Romans have survived those appalling losses inflicted on them by Hannibal, just as they've survived other losses in the First Punic War. But the ones in the Second Punic War of the legions being slaughtered at Trasimene, at Cannae and elsewhere, these are your more important, more prestigious, better off citizens, the heart of your army, rather than the poorer men who tended to end up rowing the fleets that got lost in storms in the First Punic War. The Romans have kept on recruiting more and more troops, raising more and more armies, more and more legions, so that the number of men under arms peaks after Cannae, not before. So in spite of all those early losses, then it's the classic thing, you kill one Roman, two more step up in their place, you kill those two, and then there's 10 more. And as they go on, they get more experienced and better trained. So Rome has manpower. In a long attritional struggle, as Pyrrhus had discovered, they're very hard to beat. However, that isn't really a direct factor in these campaigns, because going back to when we looked at each individual battle, each individual campaign, the Romans only ever sent a consular army east. So they're never sending more than 2 legions and a couple of allies. Now, sometimes they make those legions bigger than usual, but within the range of what's considered to be fairly routine. This is the sort of command one consul can cope with. They don't ever send 2 consuls. to fight against any of these powers, each with an army, nor are there other supporting forces. So that's it. The armies that fight these battles, yes, there'll be a few detachments, but basically that's the heart of the entire army the Romans have committed to this. So they do not swamp the Hellenistic powers with numbers. They do use allies. Again, we come back to this point. They have the Aetolians. They will later on, the Macedonians will help them fight against Antiochus, the Seleucids. So they use allies to bulk out those forces, and those allies are always critical. And the political dimension is particularly critical because when you're fighting in Greece, you're dealing with very restricted terrain where there aren't too many places where a big army can operate, let alone find a battlefield on which you can fight. One of the paradoxes of history is that the Greeks early on came up with this whole hoplite phalanx thing, which very much concentrates and requires flat ground, and there isn't a lot of flat open ground in Greece. So control of cities, control of routes through, control of passes, all of these things are very important, which brings in the diplomatic element. You've got lots of individual local powers to deal with, and they can easily change sides because whatever they feel is in their interest. So there is that complexity to it all. But the big context aspect of all of this is not so much in the numbers overall that are involved, but in the levels of experience. As I've said, the Macedonians of both Philip V and Perseus, large parts of that army have never really seen service. They haven't campaigned together a lot and they haven't fought lots of battles before. With Antiochus III, the same thing is true. The army that fights at Magnesia hasn't fought together in a battle for a long time. You have elements within that army that are very experienced, you have some experienced leaders, but it is all put together and you're learning as you go along. Now that might not have mattered if you were fighting the Romans at an ordinary time. But bear in mind, particularly for the Second Macedonian War against Philip V and the Syrian War against Antiochus III, the Roman soldiers who fight then are the men who have grown up fighting Hannibal. This is just a few years after the Second Punic War. So at every level, from the senior commanders right the way down to your humble melees, soldier who's recruited, the odds are they've done this before. And some people have done this lots and lots of times before. Some of the survivors from Cannae are sent off to Sicily to campaign there in the Second Punic War. They're eventually taken by Scipio Africanus to Africa and fight at Zama. Some of these men are still under arms, though they complain about it, but some of them do go to fight off in the Second Macedonian War. So these are people, again, that have been under arms for more than a decade or so. Nearly, getting on, pushing towards 20 years for some of them. And they fought a lot in that time. And yes, they've survived a disaster like Cannae, but they've done a lot of winning since then. They've been topped up by survivors from other Roman defeats as well. But nevertheless, you have this exceptionally experienced and confident Roman army in terms of its manpower. It's not just the quantity, it's the sheer quality. These people are good. They know how to win, and they expect to win. And you have commanders like Flamininus who are elected very young because they've shown lots of talent. By the time you get to the Third Macedonian War against Perseus, that's starting to wear down a bit, but you have had for the first 20 years or so of the 2nd century BC a lot of campaigning. It begins to slow after that. So some of the men there, there are examples. Aemilius Paulus is supposed to go in and have to restore traditional tough discipline. Sentries have been found sleeping on guard, that sort of thing. And so there's an element where that experience, because it isn't an institutional thing. This is something lots of individuals have gained this, but eventually those people will get too old to serve. And there isn't, an institutional way of passing it on to the next generation. This is not a professional army. So the Romans are amateurs just as much as the bloke who's called out to serve in a phalanx regiment because he's within that district, within that town, that city, but probably hasn't fought very much. Early on, the Romans who were called up have fought an awful lot, and even by the time of Pydna, there's still a leaven of experience, especially amongst the officers, that's there. And there is also that immense confidence that we've been winning. Since we beat Hannibal, we've beaten just about everybody else we've fought. By the time of the Fourth Macedonian War, when things don't go well for the Romans against a far less sophisticated enemy, the quality and the level of experience has gone down. So let's think about the armies and the tactics. We've already talked about the quality in that the Romans are really the pick of the bunch. These are amongst the best Roman armies ever to take the field. Now, obviously, the main clash is between the pike phalanx and the legionary with their manipular formation. So let's look at Polybius, because it's interesting that writing in the second half of the 2nd century BC, Polybius actually talked about this at some length in Book 18. So I'll skim through some of this. We won't read the whole passage, but just give an idea. He saw this as the the big difference between the Romans and Macedonian Seleucids and the like. My 6th book, I promised that when a suitable occasion presented itself, I would institute a comparison between the Roman and Macedonian equipment and formation, showing how they differ for better or worse. And I will, now that we see them both in actual practice, endeavour to fulfil this promise. For since the Macedonian formation in former times was proved by the experience of facts to be superior to other formations in use in Asia and Greece, and that of the Romans likewise showed itself superior to those in use in Africa and among all the peoples of Western Europe, since now in our own times, not once, but frequently, these two formations and the soldiers of both nations have been matched against each other, it will prove useful and beneficial to inquire into the difference, and into the reason why, on the battlefield, the Romans have always had the upper hand and carried off the palm, so that we may not, like foolish men, talk simply of chance and felicitate the victors without giving any reason for it, but may, knowing the true causes of their success, give them a reasoned tribute of praise and admiration. It will not be necessary to dilate upon the battles of the Romans with Hannibal and their defeats therein, for there they met with defeat, not owing to their equipment and formation, but owing to Hannibal's cleverness. As for Pyrrhus, so it's interesting, he's saying, well, the Romans didn't lose to Hannibal because of their military system, which of course he praises heavily in Book 6, because Hannibal was just smarter and better at fighting than they were. As for Pyrrhus, he employed not only Italian arms, but Italian forces, placing cohorts of these and cohorts composed of men from the phalanx in alternate order in his battles with the Romans. But still, even by this means, he could not gain a victory, but the result of all their battles was always more or less in doubt. That when the phalanx had its characteristic virtue and strength, nothing can sustain its frontal attack or withstand the charge can easily be understood for many reasons. For since, when it was closed up for action, each man with his arms occupies a space of 3 feet in breadth, and the length of the pikes is, according to the original design, 16 cubits, but is adapted to actual need 14 cubits, from which we must subtract the distance between the bearer's 2 hands and the length of the weighted portion of the pike, behind which serves to keep it couched, 4 cubits in all. It is evident that it must extend 10 cubits beyond the body of each hoplite when he charges the enemy, grasping it with both hands. Consequence is that while the pikes of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th ranks extend farther than those of the 5th rank, those of that rank extend 2 cubits beyond the bodies of the men in the 1st rank, when the phalanx had its characteristic close order as regards both depth and breadth. For this, we can easily conceive what is the nature and force of a charge made by the whole phalanx when it is 16 deep. In this case, those further back and the 5th rank cannot use their pikes so as to take any active part in the battle. They therefore do not fully level their pikes, but hold them slanting up in the air over the shoulders of those in front of them so as to protect the whole formation from above, keeping off by this serried mass of pikes all missiles which, passing over the heads of the 1st ranks, might fall on those immediately in front of and behind them. But these men, by the sheer pressure of their bodily weight in the charge, add to its force, and it is quite impossible for the 1st ranks to face about. In the case of the Romans, also each soldier with his arms occupies a space of 3 feet in breadth, but as in their mode of fighting, each man must move separately, as he has to cover his person with his long shield, turning to meet each expected blow, uses his sword both for cutting and thrusting. Obvious that a looser order is required, and each man must be at a distance of at least 3 feet from the man next to him in the same rank, those in the front and behind him if they are of proper use. Emphasize this next bit. The consequence will be that one Roman must stand opposite 2 men in the 1st ranks of the phalanx, so that he has to face and encounter 10 pikes. Both impossible for a single man to cut through all in time once they are at close quarters, by no means easy to force their points away, as the rear ranks can be of no help to the front rank, either in thus forcing the pikes away or in the use of the sword. So it's easy to see that, as I said at the beginning, nothing can withstand the charge of the phalanx as long as it preserves its characteristic formation and force. Now, there's a tendency with Hellenistic authors, and Polybius is more practical than many, but there's this emphasis on sort of maths and almost geometry about this. So here the argument is, well, the Romans take up more space than the Macedonians, so the Romans are going to be facing 2 Macedonians straight ahead of him, but also you've got the men in the 2nd rank, the men in the 3rd rank, 4th rank, and 5th rank, and the points of their sarissai are actually poking through ahead of the man in front. Doesn't mean the Romans fighting 10 heads of spearheads all at the same time. He may be fighting two if Polybius' figures for the frontage are right. That's a whole nother big issue, which we can talk about another day, because it depends on so many other things, and a lot of theories have been put forward about this. You have to be careful, obviously. Here's a lovely Peter Connolly illustration from still one of my favourite books. I've still got the battered copy I had as a kid. Peter Connolly's Roman Army at War. And the first section was on the Republican army of Polybius. And he shows this diagram of your Roman charging forward. He has him throwing two pila, then charging in at a sword. You've got one pila bent. Peter later on was the first to point out that actually that assumption was wrong, that it was only the javelins of the velites that were designed to bend, and the others just broke or stuck in. Another one, nearly at his throat, and then this poor Macedonian pikeman with this rather unwieldy 18-foot sarissa. The Romans dodge past and is coming towards him. So that's the pattern if you've got one man against one. But obviously a pike is not a weapon to be used by an individual. It's not, it's denying its whole basic function and design. It's to be used by formation, and Polybius emphasizes formation. So he oversimplifies things to a great extent, but his point is, his claim is that if the Macedonians stay together, if the pikemen stay together, it's going to be incredibly difficult for any Roman to fight his way to get to them. Now he might, as the Peter's diagram showed, throw the pila, and that might do some damage. There'll be some protection from the pikes of the ranks behind that are raised and are therefore partly over the head. That might break the force, might even stop a pilum coming in. On the other hand, it might not. But if the phalanx remains neat and in perfect formation, then how do the Romans get to it? You have the case, Plutarch talks about a pidna, a unit of allies that throw their standard into the phalanx and then charge trying to recover it, but can't. And a lot of people get killed in the process. You have, again, the story, this is, I think is that one, Pydna? I can't remember, but again, from the same book, Peter Connolly's The Roman Army, you've got, again, one of these very evocative illustrations. I remember a lot of these fascinated me, where you have the Romans coming up on the left of our picture against the serried ranks of pikes, the sarissai, the shields there. You've got missiles going overhead, but you've got a little bit of broken ground where the Romans can creep up, and they're getting in between these pikemen that are there on the bottom right. I still, it always fascinated me. I'm never quite sure what was supposed to have happened with the pilum. That's, I think it was one of his little jokes that's coiled around the pikes there on the bottom right. But and it shows the Romans taking advantage. The Romans are coping a little bit better, but it's very much a close-up. And of course, it's always a difficult thing to present a clear image of what's going on in ancient battles. And the whole nature of combat is one of these difficult things that people often assume it's really simple and they know what's going on. But actually, when you think about it, when you start looking at the sources, there are quite a lot of problems. And it is, again, it's a theme I'll come back to after I finish the well, after it's already finished, but after it's released, the Athens and Sparta book. The next book I'm going to be doing is on ancient warfare. So expect not only that in a few years' time, which will look at all these things in great detail again, but also a lot more talks on those themes over the years to come while I'm working on it. And actually our theme of looking at individual battles, that will be something I'll be doing as I'll be going along as well. That works with that. But think of the Chigi vase, where you have one of the best representations, probably a phalanx, is fighting each other, and it's still got all sorts of problems and issues. There's only one rank in each case. Other people running up supports or supposed to represent more people. The spears people have over their shoulders. Some people say, well, that's just extra ranks. It's a very hard thing to do, particularly on the scale. Even when we're looking at Kynocephali, which is the smallest of our battles, all told there are more than 50,000 people at the very least, and perhaps as much as 60,000 involved in that. It's a big, complicated thing. It's very hard to depict. So, Polybius's argument, and many people would follow this, is that if you allow it to just go straight forward, then the phalanx is unbeatable, as long as it stays in formation, because you simply can't get to it. There are issues with that because obviously at a battle like Chaeronea, where the Thebans, Athenians and their allies are fighting against Philip II, that is described as very hard fighting, even though you'd have to say even more than the Romans. Well, how are the hoplites getting to within spear's reach of the pikemen if they've got this same problem of all these spearheads, pikeheads to get past? Even if they're more densely crowded than the Romans were, nevertheless, there's still that successive rows of spearheads you've got to somehow break, push aside, do all that sort of thing before you physically can actually stab at and reach the man holding it. And yet the Macedonians do suffer casualties in that. So something is going on. There is a lot more to it. It is more complicated than we think. There are, however, a few incidents in these conflicts where, in one case, for instance, a Macedonian pike phalanx is formed up in a breach. Apologies for that, I'd forgotten to mute my phone, but don't worry about it too much. It's hopefully doesn't interrupt my flow. I won't stop the video and restart. We'll just cope with that. It's less impressive than Gussie adding in his 2 penneth, but nevertheless, hopefully you can ignore that. You have a case where a pike phalanx forms up in this narrow spot in a breach and basically stays in formation and the Romans cannot break through it. You have, again with defences at Thermopylae, Antiochus's men do the same thing. They hold the Romans up to the front. However, at each of the battles, something happens to break up this cohesion. So let's look at them in turn. Cynocephali, you have an encounter battle. The vanguards bump into each other. They are heading in opposite directions through the same pass in the Dog's Head Hills. Each army deploys, and each army deploys from its march column by wheeling to the right. Tradition was that would match your battle formation. Therefore, the units that are ahead of the column get to wheel to the right and eventually take up position on your far right flank. There they form up. So if you think about it, one is coming this way and one is coming that way. So that one goes that way and that one goes that way. You'd have some snazzy looking graphics if this was a proper YouTube channel, but I haven't got time for that sort of thing. Hopefully the idea is simple enough. So the key thing to remember is that the people who are at the head of the column get to form up first because they get there first, they get to their position. Everybody else is still moving until they're in position and waits to stop until they get to their own post. So it does mean the people on the right of your army, to the head of your column, get more time to form up in good formation to be ready for the battle. The ones at the back of the column that will form your left have much less time. And not coincidentally, when the two armies attack each other, Philip V's men have the advantage if they're coming down slope. His right flank breaks through the Roman right flank, and the Roman right flank breaks through his right flank, because in each case you've got your best prepared and formed troops fighting against the least prepared and formed troops of the enemy, because they've been rushing to get there. So that's fairly equal at that stage. However, seeing the Roman left flank en route, an unnamed tribune takes 20 maniples from either the rear line or the two rear lines of the successful legions on the Roman right, moves them round and attacks Philip's successful men in the rear. They collapse. The battle is won by the Romans. It's essentially the essence of it. So their success has been their undoing, but it's because the Romans have reacted. They have been able to take troops who are not yet committed, not yet fighting, move and bring them around from the reserve effectively to take out the successful part of the Macedonian army, whereas Philip's men just seem to be steaming forward, pursuing the Romans they've beaten. Come back to that in a minute. At Magnesia, the Romans do well on the right under Eumenes. Antiochus does well on his right, facing the Roman left. Quite possibly his cataphracts may even break through part of a legion or much of a legion plus allied troops. There is a major breakthrough and Antiochus's leading elements get towards the Roman camp where they're held off and some of the Roman fleeing troops are rallied. In the meantime, the Roman right, with Eumenes playing a conspicuous role, have defeated their counterparts and have started to threaten the phalanx that gives way slowly at first, grudgingly, but eventually the war elephants panic, trample people. The scythe chariots they've relied upon have been defeated by a combination of cavalry and skirmishers. The elephants, again, there's this whole pattern of letting them through. So again, what happens is that the Romans make a breakthrough and are able to exploit it to defeat the rest of the army. Antiochus makes a breakthrough and isn't able to exploit it because he doesn't have reserves. Pydna, little bit more complicated, not because of anything really subtle going on, because it seems to be a battle of small details. The two armies deploy, the Macedonians attack, the Romans meet them. It is extremely hard fought, but the key to this victory is that we're told that the phalanx has broken up. Gaps have opened up between units, perhaps even between individual ranks, and the Romans are able to filter through and start to actually reach the pikemen themselves. They're not having to fight their way past all these 10 spearheads. They're able to come in from the flank. The pikemen obviously can't go turning around quickly, because with a great long pole like that, you're getting into Laurel and Hardy with a ladder country. But also, once again, the Romans start to eat into the separated fragments of the phalanx and chop it up. There are no reserves to plug those gaps because the Macedonians don't fight that way. So there is a big difference in philosophy as well, beyond the specific tactics of phalanx against legion, because we have to remember in none of these battles is it just a phalanx fighting a legion, or let alone just one pikeman fighting one legionary, as we saw in the diagram. Other parts of the army, cavalry, light troops, elephants even on some occasions, try to play a role with more or less success. The elephants the Romans had at espcially do seem to have helped in spearheading the breakthrough. Perseus is supposed to have formed this sort of anti-elephant corps of men in spiky armour and all this sort of thing in the Third Macedonian War that it doesn't work out terribly well. And Antiochus doesn't get much from his elephants at Magnesia. They don't achieve very much, nor do his scythe chariots achieve very much. The Romans typically deploy in the triplex acies, the 3 lines. That means that at the very least, 2/3 of your heavy infantry are not committed to battle from the start. So they do have reserves. This is something Alexander doesn't do. The closest you get is Gaugamela, where you have a second line behind the main phalanx. But it isn't really a reserve. It's more because you're a bit worried the Persians might surround your infantry. It's more like advancing in a big hollow square. They are not used as a tactical reserve that is brought to plug a gap or exploit a success. They're not manoeuvred in that way, because Alexander isn't there to tell them what to do, and he's too busy to see what's going on. And most of his other commanders are doing an Alexander, but in their own particular section of the frontage. The Roman system is different. Now, the tradition of the Macedonian way of fighting argues for a prominent and heroic role for the king or commander. They don't always go as far as Alexander and his sort of risk-taking, but nevertheless, something is expected of them. So that's partly a restriction, but it's also just the doctrine. One thing to note, Polybius talks about 16 deep as the sort of, what he seems to see as the standard phalanx depth in his period. Earlier on, under Alexander and Philip II, you would have probably talked about 8 in most cases. They could do 16, and one day we'll do something on Issus and the big formation changes they do there and the approach and all this sort of thing. It comes back to quality over quantity. Quantity is what the later armies have. They've got lots of people they can equip and give enough drill to that they can function reasonably well in a block of pikemen. But they can't do the subtle formation changes and manoeuvres that Philip's men, Alexander's men could do. I remember the time when he's campaigning before he goes off to Persia, and Alexander's men just basically go through a drill routine to impress the tribesmen watching them from the hills, and it's so eerie it scares people. You can't do that later on because you haven't got this army that's serving for so much of the time, is so experienced and so well trained. So you tend to go for deeper, thinking, well, that will allow them to endure longer. Bear in mind as well, at all of Philip and Alexander's battles, as far as we can see, they do not rely on the phalanx on its own winning the fight. Even Polybius' description talks about how the phalanx is going to be irresistible, but it doesn't say how it's going to win. It might eventually tire the enemy out and grind them down, but it's quite hard to go on stabbing at that distance against Romans with big shields. You might force the formation back, you're not necessarily going to kill that many of them that quickly. The phalanx wasn't supposed to be a battle winner on its own. It was supposed to be part of this hammer and anvil tactics, if you use it simply, of the companion cavalry and others launching these attacks, especially if you've opened up a gap into the enemy wider formation. However, over time, the phalanx has become more and more important, but less and less subtle, less and less sophisticated, less and less well drilled, because it doesn't have that battlefield experience that it had had in the old days. So you have more of it, and they might be more heavily equipped and better armoured than some of Philip II Alexander's men had been, but it isn't as good. It will stand there. It is a speed bump, a roadblock. It will tie the enemy down, it will put constant pressure on them, but it is probably not going to win the battle on its own. So one big thing is that you don't have reserves because it's not part of your military system, not part of your culture, whereas the Romans do. And the Romans are able to use them at espcially in particular, but also to an extent at Magnesia and at Pydna. When the Romans break through, there's nothing to stop them. There isn't a second line of phalanx units that might have covered the gaps. Gaps are a big problem for lots of people when they come to think about ancient battles. But the idea of a solid phalanx stretching on for a mile, 2 miles or more, without any gaps between its constituent units, really does not make much sense. I'll go on to this in more detail. Sometime before too long I'll do one on the Battle of Issus, because there's a big feature there where you can actually see this demonstrated. It is abundantly clear there is space between units. So if you think back to Polybius talking about Pyrrhus and how he interspersed units of his phalanx with local allies, and some of them fighting in their own Italian way with their own equipment, doesn't suggest a solid wall-to-wall pike block. At Magnesia, Antiochus put elephants between units of the phalanx. Again, gaps. Gaps are normal because if you're going to move over any distance at all, over any sort of field, then you need them. Otherwise you're going to end up with a mob rather than ordered formations. And it's very clear that the aim with the pike phalanx was ordered formations that were distinct, had their own officers as well as their own file leaders, this sort of thing. So there are some gaps between these units as a normal thing. So the Roman formation is probably more open with wider gaps between the maniples, but it's a question of degree. It's not that the others are solid formations. They need that because they need that to advance over any sort of distance, and in all of these battles the Macedonians do advance. This is not a static formation where you just stand there in all the major battles and wait for them to come to you. The formation naturally breaks up. It happens with Alexander's troops. It happens at Issus, it happens at Gaugamela, and those are very well drilled. So that it happens to Perseus's men at Pydna is not surprising. And it is clearly not fatal immediately because these gaps are there as a normal thing. Again, but it comes back to this Roman system of several lines of maniples with the ones behind covering the intervals between the units ahead of them. That's a better, more solid system, even though it might look like it, than the one line of big blocks of 32 ranks deep or 11 or 16 ranks deep. There's arguments over whether at Magnesia they were 32 deep, perhaps even at Pydna, depending on the numbers there. Again, going for depths, keeping your troops there as long as possible. It's going to be hard for everybody to run away with so many men behind them, but not really subtlety. But you're not using those troops as anything more than a moral support to the men in front. Whereas the Roman system allows them to be deployed, either sent in as a new wave to reinforce the fighting line, or sent off to deal with problems elsewhere, as they were at espcially, as they were at Zama with Scipio's men. So the tactical system for the Romans is considerably more flexible than that of the Hellenistic armies they face. And that's reinforced by our last point, experience and approach to war, which we've already touched on, is that the Romans they fight, the Hellenistic armies, kingdoms choose the worst possible time to fight against Rome, because this is when the Romans army of that era is at its height, at its absolute peak. It will deteriorate later in the 2nd century BC before the army morphs into the semi-professional, then professional army of the 1st century BC and then Augustus and onwards, and becomes a very different beast again. That army will of course have some encounters with pike phalanxes from Pontus and scythe chariots and all this sort of stuff, but the context is very different for those. That's why we haven't really talked about it today. So the Romans are very experienced, their leaders are very experienced. If there is a depth to Roman society, it's that if one commander fails, he can be replaced by somebody else. So think to the Second Macedonian War. Doesn't go too well at first. They send Flamininus. He will eventually win it, though he's thought about making peace before outright victory if he's the one who'll get the credit for it. Third Punic War, things don't go so well. They choose Aemilius Paulus, a real tough old veteran, send him. They have the time because they're choosing to send an army to Asia after the defeat of Antiochus' expedition to Greece. They can choose Lucius Scipio with Africanus there in support. He's not at Magnesia. So the Romans have greater resources in terms of high command than is probably true of the Hellenistic armies at this time. Again, it's at this time. If the Romans had come up against Alexander's armies, or those of his immediate successors, different kettle of fish altogether. Not just because obviously the Romans back then are less experienced than they were, but you can't just base everything on system. You can have an army with exactly the same equipment, but it doesn't perform well as one that has worse equipment but has a better doctrine, better motivation, more confidence, does things. So these sorts of things, which are much, much harder to pin down often with ancient armies, they are just as vital in this period as they are today. So you have that. You also have the approach to warfare. When Pyrrhus comes to Italy, the Romans lose two big battles against him. They're hard fought, they can claim something, but they suffer heavy casualties and they're defeated. But they keep on going and eventually they defeat him in the final battle, and he goes away. When the Romans come to Macedonia, Philip II is beaten in one battle and quits. Perseus defeated in one battle and quits. Antiochus defeated in one major battle in Magnesia. You've had the earlier expedition that's failed, and decides that, no, I don't want to go on with this war, I've got problems elsewhere, let's cut my losses. There is a profound cultural difference between the two sides in that the Romans don't give in. Now, they don't need to bang their heads against the wall, suffer appalling casualties when they're fighting the Hellenistic kingdoms in the way they've just done against Hannibal, but that shows what they will do if necessary. In fact, they don't need to. Now, some of that comes down to the resources. They could, if they needed, replace their manpower, raise another army, just that they never have to do that when they're fighting the Hellenistic kingdoms. The Hellenistic kingdoms cannot. There's prestige of the king to be concerned, but also you are recruiting from very specific parts of the population. Antiochus has this big empire, but for his phalanx, for the sort of Macedonian element, the core, the heart of the army, there are only certain groups that are a minority of your population that you can recruit for these. And when you've got a lot of them killed, it's very hard to get new ones quickly. You've got to wait for them to mature, basically, to grow old. And it's a little bit like, I suppose, there's an idea when Alexander presents these Asian orphans that he's trained as Macedonian troops and shows them off to the veterans, and they're not impressed. But the idea of, oh, well, you're getting old, I need to replace you. It takes a long time to develop this. As I say, the Ptolemies have some experimentation with using Egyptian troops as pikemen, and while the performance is okay, that then leads to all sorts of problems as to what do these people want in return. You can't just... So when you've got empires that still, to a fair extent, which is true of the Seleucids and even more of the Ptolemies, have an elite that is ethnically based, or at least ethnically identified, even if some of the Greeks and Macedonians are very much of mixed blood, or perhaps even other people who've simply adopted the culture and language and been accepted in that. Nevertheless, it is only part of your population. The Roman practice of extending citizenship to so many people means their population is so big that they have got replacements when they need them. So all in all, it's a combination of things. Essentially, it's timing. Hellenistic kingdoms fight the Romans at the worst possible time for them, but that's because it comes from the Second Punic War. Philip V has got involved in that. The Romans don't forget that. They see it as a stab in the back. They want to take him out and show him who's boss afterwards. Their intervention in Greece leads to the conflict with Antiochus, which in turn leads to the conflict, them sending an expedition to Asia. The way they've treated Philip V is resented by his son Perseus, and he wants to set things right. In the same way you could argue Hannibal wants to set things right after the First Punic War, and that leads to the Second Punic War. So the Romans are at the height, really, of their strength in many ways. They're also very, very determined because they've just come through what they see as a life and death struggle. and they've won at appalling costs. So when they do get angry with you, they tend not to mess about at this period. Even so, again, look at the Second and Third Macedonian Wars. The early campaigns are fairly uninspired and lackluster by the Roman commanders. It takes a while before they really get going, but once they bring it to a head, they tend to win. The Romans win all the key battles, and there tends to be just one battle per war, and that's it. And they win because of their military system, but they win because of the quality of the officers and soldiers at every level of these particular armies, particularly compared to the quality and levels of experience of the ones they're facing. Whilst there are some professional soldiers in the Hellenistic armies, a lot are sort of people obliged to serve, but don't do it full time, and they simply don't have the experience, the confidence of yesteryear. You know, these are not Philip II's men, they're not Alexander's men. So that's it for today. We've touched on lots of aspects of this. As I say, I'll come back to a lot of this in detail. I've lost track of how long this video is, surprise, surprise, but hopefully it'll put together reasonably well and be fairly coherent, and at least go some way to answering those questions raised that I listed right at the start. So anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for watching.